Now, UK Prime Minister Theresa May says more details on Britain's vision for a future relationship with the European Union will be released after the June European Council summit later this week. Well, Femi Oladehin, partner investment banking at Argentil Capital Partners, joins me now to discuss the wider impact this will have on the African region. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Femi. Let's just talk about, of course, before we begin to narrow down to West Africa, the impact this is going to have. We, of course, have heard about the recent protests. There's so many questions left unanswered. The transport section, especially the aviation sector in the UK, is also worried, and calling for many to prepare, airports in the EU to prepare for what's to come. But what do you make of really what's playing out today?
Look, I mean, when Brexit elections happened, we all felt at that time that this was one of the biggest occurrences in global politics since literally the Berlin Wall fell in the early 90s. And it's playing out exactly the way we thought it was going to play out. There's a lot of chaos all over the place. No one exactly knows what the UK is going to look like post-Brexit. And from a corporate point of view, the same stories we talk about in Africa. Corporates don't like uncertainty. People want to know exactly what they're walking into. They want to make 3-year long-term plans. And the whole Brexit dilemma just makes it very difficult for them. And I think that the UK government is going to be under a lot more pressure as the deadline gets closer. They need to sort something out by 2019. They will need to come up with a deal. Now, Theresa May has been able to stave off some level of dissent from within her own party. I don't know how much longer she will be able to do that without having to fall on a sword at some point. But these are very, very great times for the UK, both from an economic point of view and even from a political point of view.
This is why we'll actually wait, to see what that agreement really entails. There are lots of speculations, really, and many actually, preparing for what's to come. I mean, we talk about there are those who anticipate, a drop in demand for African exports should the Brexit deal go through, especially for natural resources. Though, what I'm actually saying this is because, I mean, you have the fact that the UK has actually been always a natural conduit, right, when it comes to, of course, conducting exports from many African countries into the EU to begin with. Take a look at Kenya, following the news, of course, earlier. Sometime in 2017, I believe, we did witness a drop in demand for Kenyan tea from about 5.3 million tons to about 3.1 million tons at that particular point in time. So people are saying, I mean, of course, with just something, I wouldn't call it something as little as that, because basically the UK actually buys about 50% of what's actually produced in Kenya. Yeah. So when you have that fear already existing, that it might be a demand in African exports, one begins to wonder, what should we expect?
Look, I think that from a trade point of view, we're almost back to Cold War days in reality. You've got the US president who's basically picking up trade wars with every single country or every single trading bloc all over the place. You've got China retaliating. You've got the EU threatening to retaliate. And the reality is that in the middle of all of this stands this huge continent that has been a resource source for the rest of the world, and that's Africa. Now, again, it's about leadership right now, because if Africa sees itself as being at the forefront of trade, this is the time to be able to step in as a continent and provide the buffer that the rest of the world needs at this point in time. However, there are even some more fundamental issues. Understanding that those trade flows in the first place, which is that the fact is Africa uses the UK as a conduit into the rest of Europe. Understanding that there is a need now for Africa to actually start to look at trade from a bilateral point of view. And that is, we're talking to the EU on one hand, and understanding that the UK is also a market that you still want to play in, albeit at on a lower scale. But we have to take a more strategic approach to trade now. Everyone seems to be looking inwards, and Africa can't, simply just ignore the social-political implications of that.
Yeah, so Femi, if I get what you're saying, and that's what I want to believe as well, there really is no cause for alarm at the moment. I mean, it's a case of course, renegotiating deals with the UK. It's all a matter of what you're bringing to the table at the moment. I mean, the UK has also started its roadshow, to most African countries, talking about the fact that we're still open for business and whatnot. But let's talk about how prepared you think the continent is really for what's coming. While companies position themselves for the final decision and what's really going to play out. Do you think, that economies here in Africa are also positioning themselves to strike these deals? I mean, we are still within trying to reconcile trading amongst ourselves and dealing with countries that are not part of the agreement. So how well positioned do you think we are?
I think that we, from an absolute point of view, I would say we're not exactly well positioned, because obviously what you need Africa to do is to have a united front, these conversations. And the fact that we haven't been able to sort out the intra-Africa trade has been one of the biggest issues. If we look at even just moving around within Africa, if you're going to Morocco, you may need to go to Europe first before coming down. So you have all those issues that need to be resolved. However, I think that the bigger opportunity for Africa today is that this agreements give us an opportunity to actually start to negotiate from a position of strength rather than position of weakness that we're operating with before. Because in the beginning, or a few years ago, Africa was focused on trade and aid. All of a sudden, we're in a position now where no one is talking about aid as much as possible. So Africa's position has to be strengthened now and say that, look, what we want is to be trading as equal partners, not this one-way flow of resources going to you and you're sending back the same resources to us, but in refined capacity. Africa needs to ensure that we industrialize. So for me, the biggest opportunity for the continent is this is the time for us to start to talk about the industrialization of Africa, so that we don't just become a resource, we don't remain the resource pool for the rest of the world, but now we can actually convert that resource into proper finished goods, and that's exactly what we're exporting to the rest of the world.
I was just going to ask you, what do you hope will come out at the end of the day? A soft Brexit or a hard Brexit? I mean, a soft Brexit in a sense where, of course, you understand you don't have that, what I call a complete divorce, and you save Africans more of that trouble of having to negotiate separately to begin with. But just like you mentioned earlier, it still has to do with preparedness at the end of the day. But what do you hope will come out of this meeting? Look,
the UK is going to get a hard Brexit. Whether they like it or not, that's what the rest of Europe want. Because the rest of Europe needs to send a message to everyone else that is in Europe that coming out of this marriage is going to be painful, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to have consequences. And that's the approach that the EU is going to negotiate from with a final deal for the UK. And I still go back to saying that this is an opportunity for Africa to basically step in as a preferred trading partner for Europe, and also maintain its long-standing relationship that it's always had with the UK.
So let's just prepare for the worst, really.
We know that that is exactly what's going to happen.